My grandmother had a secret boyfriend for 30 years. My grandfather knew the entire time and loved her enough to say nothing. My name is Rosalind Ochterberg, 31. My grandparents, Vera and Emmerich, were married 52 years, and to everyone who watched them, they looked like the couple you measure your own relationships against. When my grandfather died 3 years ago, my grandmother followed this spring, and I volunteered to clear out the house. I found the shoebox in the back of her closet, beneath a stack of quilts, wrapped in a scarf I recognized from photos of her in the 70s. Inside were letters, dozens of them, spanning almost 30 years, the earliest postmarked when my mother was a toddler, the most recent less than 2 years before my grandmother's death. None were from my grandfather. The handwriting belonged to a man named Casimir, a name I'd never once heard spoken in a family that talked about everyone, endlessly, at every holiday. I read 4 before I had to sit on the closet floor. They weren't scandalous in the way I'd braced for. They were devastating in a quieter way, decades of a man writing about small things, a garden he'd planted, a book he thought she'd love. In a tone so tender and sustained it read less like an affair and more like an entire second marriage conducted almost entirely on paper. I found an address on an old envelope, a town 2 hours away. I drove there on a Saturday and found Casimir still living there, 89, sharp-eyed, unsurprised to see me on his porch holding a shoebox that clearly wasn't mine. He invited me in before I'd said more than my grandmother's name. He told the story slowly, over tea. He and my grandmother met when she was 26, 4 years into her marriage, at a point when that marriage had nearly ended. My grandparents, he said, had married young and badly, not out of love. But the pressure 2 families had applied to 2 people who'd dated briefly and gotten swept toward a wedding neither had fully chosen. By their 4th year, they were, in his words, 2 people sharing a house and little else. Staying together, because divorce then would have cost my grandmother almost everything. They fell in love slowly, over the following year, and eventually my grandfather found out not through gossip, but because my grandmother finally told him herself, expecting the marriage to end there. It didn't end. My grandfather, Casimir said, sat with it for weeks and came back with an arrangement instead of an ultimatum. He told her he understood their marriage was never built on the love she'd found elsewhere, and he wasn't willing to destroy the family they were building. My mother had just been born over something he couldn't give her himself. He asked only for discretion, for the appearance of a stable marriage for the children's sake, and for her to remain, in every practical way, his partner. In exchange, he'd never interfere, never ask her to end it, and would carry the knowledge privately. She agreed. They met perhaps 6 or 7 times a year for 3 decades. Always brief, always careful, sustained mostly through the letters, until age made even that difficult, and the letters became the entire relationship for its final years. I asked if my grandfather had ever seemed to resent it, in all the years he knew. Casimir said he'd met my grandfather once, decades earlier, by accident. My grandfather looked at him a long moment, said nothing accusatory, and simply asked him to take care of her in a voice neither bitter nor performative, just tired, honest, and strangely generous for a man in his position. I drove home, turning over an entire childhood of assumptions. My grandparents' marriage had been real in its own way, a genuine partnership, real family, real affection, built over 5 decades, but it had also been a container my grandfather deliberately built around a love that was never fully his to keep. Because he'd decided, early on, that giving her that space was worth more than forcing her to pretend she didn't need it. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand a love generous enough to share a wife with a stranger for 30 years rather than lose her. Or a woman capable of building a tender parallel life, while still, by every account, loving the man she went home to. I only know I buried my grandmother believing I understood her completely. And I've spent the months since learning the people who raise us are always larger, stranger, and more complicated than the versions we're handed. I still have the letters. I haven't decided whether to keep them or return them to Casimir, who is, as far as I know, still living quietly in that house. writing letters to a woman who can no longer read them.